Thank you, Eric, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the John Whitmer Historical Association for the invitation. It's an honor to gather here today on the fall equinox, or Moroni Day, 200 years after Joseph Smith's visions of an old man, later called Moroni. I'm delighted to share some of my research with the John Whitmer Historical Association in the beautiful setting of Fredericksburg, Texas, on the traditional lands of the Humanos, Kickapoo, Comanche, and Lipan Apache nations. Long before and after Mormons, Germans, and other settler colonialists arrived in this place, indigenous people have stewarded this land. These relationships of stewardship, although marred by settler colonialism, remain vital to the sustainability of our communities today. I deeply appreciate the invitation to address indigenous entanglements of the Latter-day Restoration movements that originated in the traditional lands of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois. These nations include the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. Today's presentation is drawn from a book manuscript, Unsettling Scripture, Neophytes and Lamanites in the Book of Mormon. This book reevaluates Latter-day engagements with Haudenosaunee people and traditions. Haudenosaunee precedents for Latter-day scriptural production and Christology appear to be a blind spot in Mormon historiography. Recent scholarly treatments of open canons in Latter-day Saint traditions, as represented in the book covers on this slide, have consistently overlooked indigenous scriptural productions. Many seem to uncritically accept the erroneous and ethnocentric claim made by the esteemed historian Philip Barlow in his classic analysis of Mormons in the Bible. Quote, "The Book of Mormon remains the only important second Bible produced in this country," end quote. Barlow never mentioned the hieroglyphic parchments of the Assinnisinc and Delaware prophets Wangamund and Neolin, who had produced their own Bibles several decades before Joseph Smith would search for treasure and dictate the Book of Mormon in the same Susquehanna Valley, where their prophetic movements had once flourished. The image pictured in the slide is a reconstruction of Neolin's hieroglyphic parchment by a settler, John McCullough, held captive by the Delaware from 1756 to 1762. Barlow similarly does not mention the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake's Code, an Iroquois Bible that came from the same traditional lands as Joseph Smith's illustrious gold tablets. Handsome Lake's Gaiwí, or Good Message, began to emerge from the Seneca prophet's visions in 1799 and 1800, first spoken into wampum, that is, strings of shell beads, as an oral alternative to the Christian Bible. The Code of Handsome Lake, published by the Seneca anthropologist Arthur Parker in 1913, would function as the printed Bible of the new religion of the Iroquois without displacing canonical ascriptions also applied to oral recitations of the Gaiwí and the Peacemaker epic. John Turner's biography, The Mormon Jesus, notes, quote, "the proliferation of indigenous forms of Christianity in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often led by prophets and visionaries," end quote. Yet North America, or Turtle Island as the Haudenosaunee call it, is noticeably absent from Turner's geographic references, despite the fact that indigenous prophets such as Handsome Lake, Neolin, and Tenskwatawa had visions, produced scriptures, and crisscrossed the same terrain in the Genesee, the Canargua, and the Susquehanna valleys as the settler prophet Joseph Smith. Turner, though, does acknowledge the portrayals of Quetzalcoatl, an Aztec deity, as a Mosaic type of Christ in Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews, published in 1823 and 1825, as a possible influence on the incipient Latter-day Prophet. Yet he makes no mention at all of the Haudenosaunee Peacemaker epic, or the manifestations of Jesus in vision to Handsome Lake. When indigenous people do appear in Book of Mormon studies, the focus is on ancient Americans. The silent dead are displayed and deployed for settler colonial purposes, not their own. Although often overlooked, a counter-narrative of indigenous, and more specifically, Iroquois influence is present in Mormon and Iroquois historiography. In his 1945 article, The Mormon Migration into Texas, historian C. Stanley Banks asserted, rather ambiguously and without citation, quote, "Tradition has it that Joseph Smith, in his authorship of the Book of Mormon, was greatly influenced by his study of the beliefs of the Iroquois Indians of New York," end quote. Banks represented this tradition as well established in 1945 and projected it back into the previous century, assuming it would have aided in proselytizing Comanches. Swedish theologian Åke V. Ström contended in a 1969 article that there are strong Red Indian elements in early Mormonism. Although he focused more on Delaware than Iroquois parallels, historian Lori Taylor, in her doctoral dissertation from the year 2000, found similarities between Haudenosaunee and Mormon traditions in the visions of Handsome Lake, Joseph Smith Sr., and Lehi, the burial of weapons as a renunciation of war in the Book of Mormon and Iroquois diplomacy, resemblances between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Council of 50, similar health restrictions, replicated ceremonies, and overlap in origin stories. In his 2012 book, Seneca Possessed, historian Matthew Dennis observed that both the Seneca and Mormon prophets responded to denominational rivalry, had revelations that emanated from sacred dreams, and wrestled with profound economic change associated with the national and international market economy. Podcaster John Larson argued in a 2012 Sunstone presentation that, quote, "the descriptions of Lamanites portrayed in the Book of Mormon is consistent with 19th century understandings of the Iroquois and the archaeological interpretation of artifacts commonly found in New York State area during the time the Book of Mormon was produced," end quote. Former BYU librarian Rick Grunder has noted similarities between names, Oneida and Onondagas, or similar to Oneida and Onondaga, Handsome Lake's accounts of Jesus and those in the Book of Mormon, Handsome Lake's three messengers and the three Nephites, white dog sacrifices in Smith's treasure seeking and the Iroquois midwinter rites, and similarities between the Mohegan preacher Samson Occam and Samuel the Lamanite, a character in the Book of Mormon. Religion scholar Peter Manseau, in his 2015 book, One Nation Under Gods, has noted many of the same parallels and contended, quote, "While the birth of Mormonism is often considered in relation to other Second Great Awakening movements, in fact, the similarities pale in comparison to all that Smith's religious visions had in common with those of Handsome Lake," end quote. Literary scholar Nancy Bentley, in a contribution to the 2019 anthology Americanist Approaches to the Book of Mormon, proposed that Joseph Smith shared with Handsome Lake questions of kinship, as well as similar ideas about ancient Indian prophets, the voices of dead warriors, visions of tragic removals and defeats, an imperative to save for posterity the culture and spirituality of America's original inhabitants. And in his 2020 book, The Storied Landscape of Iroquois, historian Chad Anderson has demonstrated, quote, "Indians still exerted a cultural influence far greater than their small numbers in New York would have suggested," end quote. Mormonism, he contends, quote, "could not have emerged at another time and place other than the early American republic's newly conquered Native American homelands," end quote. One of the most striking similarities between Haudenosaunee oral traditions and the Book of Mormon comes from the Peacemaker epic, a ritually recited narrative at the heart of cultural teachings. There are numerous versions that have appeared in print over the last 2 centuries, but I want to highlight an account that has drawn particular attention with at least one Mormon denomination. The Peacemaker epic, as recounted by the traditional teacher Michael Mitchell, a Mohawk from Akwesasne, includes a description of a fatherless boy with special powers who became a leader, had 11 companions, taught sacred ceremonies, traveled across the saltwater, where he was murdered, and returned as an old man to Turtle Island. This version became part of traditional teachings, the curriculum of the Native North American Traveling College in 1984, and a decade later it would be adopted as a study text by the True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of the Last Days, or the TLC, founded in 1994 in Manti, Utah. Neophyte traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries abound with cultural heroes and prophets who teach Christian-like values and exhibit Christ-like characteristics. The lack of archaeological support for the antiquity of a Christian material culture or Israelite DNA in ancient America suggests the value of looking to both oral tradition and the historical record of neophyte communities, that is, native Christian converts, to chart the development of the Peacemaker epic over time in the geographic and cultural region from which the Book of Mormon itself would emerge. Early documents provide ample evidence of an impressive continuity in themes, characters, events, and other aspects of Haudenosaunee oral tradition, but they do not support the antiquity of the Christian allusions as inserted into much older stories. Instead, they record a lack of Christian knowledge of Jesus, a lack of indigenous knowledge of Jesus before the arrival of missionaries, and demonstrate an increasing deployment of Christian allusions in Haudenosaunee traditions over multiple centuries. Intriguingly, these Christian references are not only found among Iroquois Christians or neophytes, but also are especially prevalent among the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake's followers, despite their frequent identification as pagans. Before examining the Peacemaker epic in more detail, it would be helpful to consider how Haudenosaunee stories explain perceived similarities with Mormonism. Indigenous etiologies of the Book of Mormon speak of living Iroquois persons who played an active role in tutoring the Mormon prophet, or in some versions even helping manufacture and inscribe gold plates. In 1994, Nicholas Mormon recorded the most detailed version of a widespread oral narrative for the historian Lori Taylor. This account is available in the anthology, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, that also includes an article of mine placing the Book of Mormon within the context of these other or Iroquois scriptures. I've also published a condensed summary of the Iroquois etiology for the Book of Mormon under the title Views from Turtle Island in the Palgrave Handbook of Global Mormonism that I'll summarize now. There is a story that has been told and retold many times in indigenous communities over generations. In this oral tradition, Seneca farmhands, acquaintances of Joseph Smith Jr., tutored him on the basics of the Gaiwí, the word taught by the prophet Handsome Lake. They thought, what the white people need to do is take the best of their Christian heritage and traditions and stuff that come out of their European ways and mix it with the indigenous ways of the people who have lived on this land for a long time, end quote. To facilitate the launching of a new religion for settlers, the farmhands melted down some gold they had received as payment from the British for their role in the War of 1812. On tablets of gold, they inscribed the Gaiwí in picture writing, buried the tablets, and invited the incipient Mormon seer to find and interpret these records with a Christian influence, they said, so that your people will tune into it. Joseph Smith, as represented in this story, employs trickery with assistance from Seneca collaborators to deliver a message for his people, the settler colonialists from Europe. In this story, the Mormon prophet is cast as the settler equivalent of the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake. The prophetic message, though, quote, got watered down and changed here and there over time from what the real, true word was, from the way the Gaiwí spoke it, end quote. The Book of Mormon, they say, has, quote, too much emphasis on the Christian theme, more than there used to be, more than the way we pass it on, the Iroquois pass it on, the Seneca there to Joseph Smith, end quote. Well, what happened to the tablets after their discovery and translation? That gold, it belonged to the Seneca. It went back to its owners. Back at Tonawanda, the story goes, those tablets are still alive. Those tablets are still alive. Nicholas Mormon called this narrative the real story that tells how Mormons came to be. It's one of several versions Lori Taylor has heard and traced back to at least the 1960s. She categorized the stories by content into two strains. The first, young Joseph coming into contact with Iroquois farmhands, or the second, Joseph spending time in Indian country. Taylor traced acquaintances of those from whom she had heard the stories back to one man who knew them all, or knew who told them. This man, she said, was, quote, one of the elders who for young people in the 1960s and 70s imparted Indian wisdom and stories. He traveled extensively and spread Iroquois stories and his contemporary interpretations far and wide, end quote. The Tuscarora activist Wallace Mad Bear Anderson, Taylor surmised, is, quote, the trickster figure in the story of Handsome Lake's followers and Joseph Smith, possibly a source, possibly just a strong teller of the tale, end quote. Anderson, publicly portrayed as a medicine man, garnered significant media attention from the 1950s through the 80s for his protests against income tax assessment, dam construction on Tuscarora lands, and federal efforts to terminate tribal governments. In the 1970s, on one of his several trips to Utah, Mad Bear shared with Latter-day Saint Zula Brinkerhoff a story of a visitation he received from both Christ and Joseph Smith, together displaying the gold plates from which Smith had produced the Book of Mormon. Mad Bear's visions and prophecies captured the attention of dream miners in Utah, who held out hope that he might just be the Indian prophet, the one mighty among them, prophesied in the Book of Mormon. Mad Bear, while certainly prolific, was not likely the first purveyor of the stories of Iroquois influence on Joseph Smith. Stanley Banks claims of an existing tradition in 1945 predated Mad Bear's activism, but validating its existence a century earlier is a more daunting task. Oral traditions present significant challenges for historians and anthropologists. At best, the historical record provides snapshots of what the Mohawk scholar Darren Bonaparte calls a living history. We can test the longevity of these narratives indirectly by asking whether or not indigenous people were present in the communities where the founding events of the Restoration took place. Turns out I've identified dozens of named individuals, mostly Iroquois, who lived, studied, worked, hunted, and gathered near the Smith, Mack, and Hale families in New Hampshire, New York, and Pennsylvania. I only have sufficient time to mention a few. Jacob Jameson, a Seneca classmate of Hiram Smith's, that is Joseph's brother, at Moore's Indian Charity School, associated with Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, also lived in Rochester after the Smith family moved to Palmyra and worked as an interpreter throughout the region. He often interpreted for the Seneca orator Red Jacket, a veteran of the War of 1812, who spoke at Palmyra Academy in 1832. Old Blue Sky, John Sky, and Tommy Jenny, also known as Suningese, were all veterans of the War of 1812 and followers of Handsome Lake, who historical sources identified as frequently present off-reservation in their traditional territories around Palmyra, Manchester, and Rochester. Palmyra is located at the site of the Seneca community of Ganakwe, and not far from Ganondagan, a site associated with the Mother of Nations in the Peacemaker epic. These men, their families, and other Senecas often returned to hunt, fish, and gather through the 1850s, often camping alongside Ganargwa or Mud Creek between Ganakwe and Ganondagan, where young Joseph Jr. himself liked to fish. Joseph Smith is also documented interrogating a, quote, straggling Indian while treasure hunting in the Susquehanna Valley in the 1820s, near the former Oneida village of Onondaga. Oneida, the name of one of the 6 nations, appears intriguingly as a place name in the Book of Mormon. While this circumstantial evidence lends some plausibility to the story of followers of Handsome Lake tutoring Joseph Smith, I must note that Red Jacket, Old Blue Sky, John Sky, and Tommy Jimmy, while all veterans of the War of 1812, fought on the American rather than the British side. The gold for manufacturing plates would not likely have come from the British anyway, because they were notorious for not paying their indigenous troops. I have wondered if the details with which Mad Bear appears to have amplified an older indigenous narrative of Iroquois influence came directly from Joseph Smith himself in one of Mad Bear's visions. If so, this would be an indigenous prophet having visions of a Mormon prophet, having visions of Nephite prophets. A great topic for Moroni Day. Visions, while they can be revelatory, are not reliable sources of historical data. The specificity in the Mormon version suggests a narrative that grew over time. Some elements of the story, though, are verifiable. The historical record affirms an indigenous presence in the founding communities of the Restoration. In this respect, it is most compatible with the older, pre-Mad Bear version of the Iroquois influence, as stated by C. Stanley Banks, and I'll quote it again. Tradition has it that Joseph Smith, in his authorship of the book, was greatly influenced by his study of the beliefs of the Iroquois Indians of New York. End quote. The historical record also provides a means for testing the antiquity of Christ-like characters in Haudenosaunee traditions of the Peacemaker. Early historical documents, the Peacemaker was the founder of the Iroquois Confederacy. Early historical documents include a 1715 denial by Mohawks of any pre-contact knowledge of Jesus in an account recorded in a letter by Reverend William Andrews, one of the first Protestant missionaries to live among the Haudenosaunee. A Mohawk told the missionary, quote, "You Christians were so wicked as to crucify your God, and now he's angry with you, and therefore to pacify him, you endeavor to persuade us to serve him. But why should we? We never heard of him till Christians came here. He's not angry with us. We never did him any hurt," end quote. A 1724 investigation by the Jesuit missionary Joseph Francois Lafitteau of claims of possible cross-veneration by Mi'kmaq peoples to the east of Iroquois concluded that it had all the appearance of pious romance and was entirely absent from a century and a half of records of other Catholic missionaries and travelers prior to Father Chaitren Leclerc's 1691 account. With such an attentiveness to possible parallels with Christianity, Lafitteau would not have overlooked the presence of an Iroquois story of a teacher, an old man, or a fatherless boy who crossed the saltwater. Yet this important 18th century ethnographer and missionary made no mention of any such story. A century after Lafitteau, Ethan Smith, who served as a Presbyterian pastor in Hebron, New York, and a missionary to the nearby Oneida and Stockbridge communities from 1817 to 1821, also neglected to report any Iroquois traditions of Christ-like teachers. Smith's 1825 edition of Views of the Hebrews instead recounted the opposite, a story from 1824 about the lack of pre-contact knowledge of Jesus Christ among the Delaware, who were well represented at Stockbridge, taking refuge on Oneida lands while Ethan Smith was a missionary. Ethan Smith included a letter from February 1825 in a second edition from a Reverend Jabez B. Hyde, a missionary and linguist among the Seneca, that discussed his careful study of Seneca celebrations and old rites that had been inspired by the 1816 publication of A Star in the West by Elias Boudinette. He claimed that the elders gave him a quote, unreserved account of all they know of their ancient religion, end quote. While he says he found a most striking similitude to the Mosaic rituals, he makes no mention of an old man, a fatherless boy, peacemaker, or other Christ-like figure. Ethan Smith's second edition notably includes a substantive discussion of Quetzalcoatl, an Aztec deity that he describes as a white and bearded man. Smith described Quetzalcoatl as inaugurating a golden age, teaching metallurgy, ordering fasts, preaching peace, and forbidding sacrifices other than the first fruits of the harvest. Finally, as Smith recounted the story, Quetzalcoatl disappeared and promised to return. Quetzalcoatl's piercings and lacerations, he claimed, may have a striking allusion to the system of the Mosaic sacrifices, including the mediation of Moses as a type of Christ. Ethan Smith intriguingly turned to Mexicans for Mosaic allusions, rather than neighboring Iroquois for Christological ones. Neither Ethan Smith, Jabez Hyde, nor Joseph Lafitteau recorded descriptions of Christ-like teachers, young boys, or old men from their investigations among Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, and Stockbridge communities. Nor did these authors mention the Peacemaker, who, according to later traditions, founded the Iroquois Confederacy and initiated a great peace between the 5 and later 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee. The first appearance in the historical record of a narrative of the League's founding comes from the Moravian missionary John Christopher Perialis in 1743, who heard it from Mohawk leader David of Schoharie. This brief account mentions Tocanawida of the Mohawks as one of the 5 chiefs playing a formative role in the creation of the Confederacy. Similarly, slightly longer accounts from the Mohawk leader Joseph Brant and his adopted nephew John Norton, recorded in 1801, both mention a Mohawk Tekanawita as pivotal in organizing the Confederacy. This person is often deferentially identified as the Peacemaker today to avoid unnecessarily speaking his name. Mohawk scholar Darren Bonaparte noted, quote, when viewed as a manifestation of the living culture which evolves with the people, we can see that the Confederation epic was probably based on real events, but over time has accumulated a number of supernatural elements borrowed from the Iroquois cultural world, especially our creation story, and traditions of other nations, end quote. Those other nations, of course, include Christianity. The early accounts of the founding of a confederacy are very secular in tone and make no Christian allusions relating to the principal characters, who are represented as exemplary humans rather than as deities. The same religious enthusiasm that gave rise to the Latter-day Restoration and made settler colonial Western New York into a burned-over district also appears to have contributed to the emergence of Christian allusions and oral traditions of the founding of the Haudenosaunee League. The recounting of the League's origin that bears the most resemblance to the Book of Mormon's version of the Great Peace appeared in print in Lewiston, New York, shortly before Joseph Smith began his dictation of the extant Book of Mormon. This self-published version provided a written record and a rough English translation of Haudenosaunee oral tradition during the heart of the Second Great Awakening. David Cusick, the adopted Tuscarora son of Samuel Kirkland, a famous alumnus of Moore's Indian Charity School, the same place that Hiram later attended, and a missionary to the Oneidas, would include several Christian allusions in his translation of oral tradition published in 1827 and 1828 as sketches of ancient history of the 6 nations. Cusick's version is distinguished from earlier accounts in the historical record by the crediting of a deity, the holder of the heavens, with an early formation of the League of 5 Nations, as one household with a moral, social, and ecological prescript for a great peace. Quote, about this time it is supposed an agent from superior power solemnly visits the families, and he instructs them in various things respecting the infinity, matrimony, moral rules, worship, etc., and he offers them favorable promises for obedience to the rules. The souls would enter the place of happiness, but to the disobedient, their souls would be sent to a state of misery. gave seeds for corn, beans, squashes, potatoes, and tobacco, with directions how to cultivate them, and dogs to aid in pursuing the game. And he repeats that the great country was given for their people's maintenance, end quote. The great peace initiated by this heavenly agent would last about 100 winters before the holder of the heavens stopped visiting the community. When the holder of the heavens favored the 5 nations with his presence, they prospered in peace. But when he withdrew, they suffered arduous trials. Shifting to a more secular perspective, Cusick then described how this separation would be healed by the founding of a league. At Onondaga, a tree of peace was planted and reached the clouds of heaven, he said. Having outlined the establishment of the league among the 5 nations in both a spiritual and a secular version, Cusick returned to his own 6th nation of the Tuscarora with a separate, thinly veiled manifestation of an old man, an apparent Christ-like visitor. Quote, "The 6th family was visited by a person. The visitor appeared a very old man. He appeared among the people for a while. He taught them many things, how to respect their deceased friends, and to love their relations. He informed the people that the whites beyond the great water had killed their maker. But he rose again, and he warns them that the whites would in some future day take possession of the big island, and it was impossible to prevent it. The red children would melt away like snow before the heat. The aged man died among them, and they buried him. But soon some other person went to the grave and found he had risen, and never heard of him since." End quote. Cusick's narrative recounted many adventures and conflicts over the ensuing millennium. Cusick reported that the holder of heavens appeared in vision to a prophet who would teach that the whites would cross the big waters and bring strong liquors and buy up the red people's land. He advised them not to comply with the wishes of the whites, lest they should destroy the tree of peace and extinguish their national sovereignty. End quote. Cusick's account carefully threaded an allegiance to oral tradition and the transformation of it into a literary form comprehensible to an English-speaking audience. Mohawk author Darren Bonaparte encouraged 21st century readers to approach the text carefully, cautiously, recognizing the abundant metaphors and allegory. Literary scholar Susan Coulter reminded readers that Cusick was not just recording ancient history, but also addressing immediate issues of concern to an imagined community of contemporary Iroquois. In this respect, Cusick was not corrupting oral tradition. Rather, he was employing its adaptability in what Bonaparte calls a living history to tell of a golden age of Iroquoian unity that might be reimagined and rebuilt in the present. Cusick was not just responding to the influx of missionaries in the Second Great Awakening. He fashioned his narrative to resist the existential threat of removal facing Iroquois communities in the 1820s. Allusions to the Bible indicated that the 6 nations were already civilized, with an agricultural economy and knowledge of Christian principles before the arrival of settler colonial missionaries. Coulter reminded readers that Cusick was matching wits with the Bible, not imitating it. The keepers of oral tradition did not incorporate missionary lessons wholesale, but employed allusions strategically to claim scriptural status for oral tradition, alongside the written records of the Bible. Coulter interpreted Cusick's casting of his very old man as Christ in a thinly veiled disguise. She called it a radical innovation. While she acknowledged that many Haudenosaunee might see his approach as more of a concession, quote, overlaying his community with an Iroquois-based Christianity in order to sell their acceptability to whites on the basis of a pre-Columbian Christ-invoked awakening, end quote. Coulter summarized Cusick's arguments as follows, quote, "If God can visit Israel in human form, teach love, prophesy, die, be buried, and rise again, nothing prevents him from visiting North America," end quote. Divine manifestations can just as easily occur in Iroquois as elsewhere. Missionaries were mistaken when they assumed that, quote, Christ's teachings could reach the Iroquois and other Indians only through their own works, end quote. Not only did the 6 nations have an equivalent version of morality, The Iroquois were too civilized to kill their maker, like the whites had done. Christ is not the only deity in Cusik's narrative to awaken a great peace among the Six Nations. While the Christ-like old man initiated one great awakening, the shape-shifting holder of heavens manifested himself 3 different times, not just as a teacher awakening the people with moral principles, but also a defender demonstrating the arts of war, vanquishing enemies in order to establish peace. With this oral narrative as translated and published by Cusik was an implicit warning that if civilization and Christianity are not enough to protect Haudenosaunee sovereignty, then the holder of heavens might yet return to earth in human form to combat imminent removal or extermination of the Six Nations by the emergent United States. The earliest versions of the founding of the Iroquois Great Peace were the least similar to the accounts in the Book of Mormon, while the later versions are the most similar. Early accounts deny an ancient knowledge of Christ prior to the arrival of missionaries, yet by the 1820s, the Tuscarora oral traditions recorded by Cusik had given a Christian veneer to Haudenosaunee history, just in time for potential appropriation by the Latter-day Saint seer. Joseph Smith's Nephite record would enter this intercultural neophyte world in 1830, just a couple of years after Cusik published his sketches, and echo, allude to, and expand upon the same themes, issues, and events. Intriguingly, Joseph Smith Sr.'s earliest report of his son's acquisition of plates described the treasure guardian as an old man. When read in the order of dictation, giving chronological priority to the Book of Mosiah, then the extant Book of Mormon includes near its narrative beginning a story of Abinadi as a type and shadow of things to come that is also reminiscent of the old man narrative from Cusik. Abinadi preached King Noah and his people of a Messiah yet to come, warned the people of future afflictions, famine, and pestilence, and prophesied of other nations which shall possess the land. Abinadi warned King Noah and his people to touch me not. Yet unlike the Tuscarora old man who died a natural death, Abinadi was executed. The manifestation of Jesus in America appears to be the central message of the extant Book of Mormon. Nephi's vision in the opening book of 1 Nephi sets the stage. The angel told Nephi that there was one God and one shepherd over all the earth. The Christ introduced at the beginning of the extant Book of Mormon, just like the holder of the heavens in the old man in Cusik's account, can manifest himself independently of missionaries and is accompanied by signs and wonders. Nephi saw in vision the future birth, life, ministry, and crucifixion of a racialized Jesus. The Spirit guiding his vision told him to look, and he reported, I looked, and in the city of Nazareth I beheld a virgin, and she was exceedingly fair and white, with a child in her arms. End quote. The angel asked Nephi to recall the tree his father had seen in his vision, identifying it as the love of God, which sheddeth itself abroad in the hearts of the children of men. In narrating his vision, Nephi associates the mother of Jesus with whiteness, but also the love of God with a tree. The narrator Mormon reported that nearly 600 years after Lehi's family left Jerusalem, Nephites wondered why Christ would not show himself in this land as well as in the land of Jerusalem. Why cannot we witness with our own eyes, they asked. Shortly more signs came, a night without darkness, and a new star appeared. Even more stupendous the signs accompanied the crucifixion. A voice permeated the land, proclaiming a destruction of the wicked and preservation of the righteous. It declared, quote, the fair sons and daughters of my people had been slain because of their iniquity and abominations, end quote. The voice identified himself as Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He lamented that he came first, quote, to my own, and my own received me not, end quote. He invited the multitude to thrust your hands into my side, feel the prints of the nails in my hands and in my feet, and that you may know that I am the God of the whole earth. In this portrayal of the Christ of the Book of Mormon resembles Cusick's holder of the heavens, who had taught the arts of war and appeared in a dream after earthquakes, comets, and other signs wrought destruction upon the people, more so than the very old man who taught love and warned the people that the whites beyond the great water had killed their maker. In the third Nephi account, unlike Haudenosaunee narratives in the account of Abinadi in the Book of Mormon, Christ permitted and even encouraged touching of him and his wounds. After preaching a message of repentance, love, peace, mercy, and caring for the poor, the Book of Mormon's Jesus gathered together 12, whom he had chosen. He told them that this is the land of your inheritance, and the Father hath given it unto you. He explained that he had not told your brethren at Jerusalem about their existence, except to say that he had other sheep, which are not of this fold. Jesus said he had not manifested himself unto the Gentiles except by the Holy Ghost. But behold, ye have heard my voice and seen me, and ye are my sheep. Jesus instructed them to write these sayings after I am gone. Here Jesus seems to explain the greater witness reported by neophytes on this side of the water, and the lesser witness brought to Turtle Island by settler missionaries. Third Nephi even offers an endorsement of the three messengers who, along with Jesus as the fourth messenger, would visit Handsome Lake in his visions of 1799 and 1800. Jesus singled out three of his disciples and blessed them, that they shall never taste of death in return for their desire to bring the souls of men unto me, while the world shall stand. He offered them a place in the kingdom of my Father, promising them that ye shall be even as I am, and I am even as the Father, and the Father and I are one. The narrator Mormon explained, they are angels of God, and able to shew themselves unto whatsoever man it seemeth them good. He prophesied, quote, therefore great and marvelous works shall be wrought by them before the great and coming day, when all must surely stand before the judgment seat of Christ, end quote. Mormon told his readers that, quote, if ye had all the scriptures, which gives an account of all the marvelous works of Christ, ye would, according to the words of Christ, know that these things surely must come, end quote. Here the Book of Mormon appears to offer an ideology for and Jesus' endorsement of the divinity of the three angels that together with Jesus visited Handsome Lake and make up the four sacred beings who initiated a great and marvelous work in Haudenosaunee longhouses, a sign of the times. Third Nephi also seems to allude to other scriptures, perhaps the oral traditions contained in Handsome Lake's code. Third Nephi's Jesus condemned in his Father's name the unbelieving of the Gentiles, who have come forth upon the face of this land and have scattered my people, which are of the house of Israel. Dire consequences awaited unbelieving Gentiles, because the Father commanded me that I should give unto this people this land for their inheritance. In these passages, Jesus' father resembled Cusick's defender, who foretold that the whites would cross the big waters and urged the five nations to resist removal and defend their sovereignty. While uncomfortably framed in a language of whiteness, Book of Mormon passages also articulate a disillusioned Jesus who found greater faith in miracles among indigenous peoples than among settlers. The associations of Jesus with whiteness appear to have more in common with Ethan Smith's representation of Quetzalcoatl as a white and bearded man than they do with Cusick's Christ-like old man. In fact, Haudenosaunee oral traditions more generally do not racialize the Peacemaker. The portrait of Jesus and his father in the Book of Mormon appears to be an amalgamation of Ethan Smith's portrayals of Quetzalcoatl and those of the old man and the holder of heavens, as portrayed by David Cusick in his 1828 sketches of ancient history of the Six Nations. With the exception of its racialization, the Book of Mormon's portrayal of deity has far more in common with Cusick's old man and holder of heavens and Handsome Lake's visions than with Ethan Smith's portrait of Quetzalcoatl. Yet view of the Hebrews has often been proposed as a potential source for the Book of Mormon, while Cusick's sketches and Handsome Lake's code, neophyte sacred narratives, are rarely acknowledged in Mormon history circles. Whether Joseph Smith was actually tutored by followers of Handsome Lake or read Cusick's sketches may not be directly verifiable in the existing historical record. Yet the circumstantial evidence, particularly that coming from the Book of Mormon itself, strongly indicates that some cultural exchange took place. At a minimum, Handsome Lake, David Cusick, and Joseph Smith swam in the same intercultural waters of the Second Great Awakening. Each produced a sacred narrative that matched wits with, echoed, and alluded to the Holy Bible. When read within the context of Handsome Lake's code and Cusick's sketches, the Book of Mormon seems to endorse the divinity of the Haudenosaunee pantheon and embrace the Peacemaker epic and the Code of Handsome Lake as additional scriptures. The Book of Mormon is not the only important additional Bible emerging from the lands of the Haudenosaunee. Indigenous Christianities, led by prophets and visionaries, have proliferated in North America, not only in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Presenting the Book of Mormon as the one true account emerging from ancient America, rather than entangled settler and neophyte communities in a settler colonial context, does significant harm to indigenous perspectives. It displaces the voices of the living with those of the dead. A careful reading of the Latter-day Scripture challenges these ethnocentric interpretations. The Book of Mormon text presents itself as an incomplete record, pointing beyond its own narrative to other scriptures that contain a greater witness given to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. In honor of these indigenous entanglements, we might call the autumnal equinox Old Man Day rather than Moroni Day. Now I should have some time for questions, right?
We have about 5 minutes, and then we'll need to take a break. Tom, if you'd be willing to maybe just stay around after we go to break, and if anybody wants to add to the question. So, any questions for Dr. Murphy? Please, Paul.
I'd like to get a comment in if I could.
Sure.
I very much appreciate your cross-cultural referencing here. But the slide about the sacred sites caused me to reflect upon a presentation that the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum earlier this year by Rainbow Eagle on the Choctaw, whose research showed that there's been a great medicine wheel, and medicine wheels were used by the native peoples to work together so they have peaceful negotiations. They said there's a great medicine wheel where Joseph Smith then later designated the temple lot of Independence, a place for people to gather in peace. Where President Truman then spoke from the auditorium to announce that the United States would join the United Nations. Again, a center of focus for people gathering in peace.
Thank you, Paul. For those who may not have heard that, Paul was referencing a presentation to the Book of Mormon Perspectives by, who was the speaker again? Rainbow Eagle, who spoke of Choctaw traditions of a medicine wheel that was present at the site in Independence, and also sacred places in association with other important Mormon historical events. And I would restoration events, if we can be more inclusive there. I would add that, you know, we are on indigenous land, and this land is sacred in many ways to the traditional peoples of this area. And hopefully this reading of the Book of Mormon provides a way to validate those traditions as well. Other questions? Are we out of time?
I think we're out of time. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Murphy for his comments.